It is such a pleasure to see all of you this morning. We are so honored that you would be here. And for the sake of time, I'm just trying to, I know there are a lot of people who are still coming in, and I think there's some still at the registration desk. But in fact, I don't see where all of the San Jacinto Battleground Conservancy Board is yet here. But let me tell you just a little bit about us. My colleague Jeff Dunn is here, and Jeff, raise your hand. Jeff Dunn called me in the summer of 2002. We had worked on the San Jacinto Historical Advisory Board together, which is, both of us had been appointed by Governor George W. Bush. Our job was to advise Texas Parks and Wildlife on the historical interpretation of the San Jacinto battleground. There was a need, the two of us felt like there was a need for an organization, a 501c3, who was dedicated to the preservation of that battlefield. It is a National Historic Landmark. It is one of the great battles of the world, and there was not an organization dedicated to the preservation, conservation, reclamation of that battlefield. So one of the first things we did, we started buying land, which we own roughly 30 acres. If you have ever looked at purchasing land on what is now the Houston Ship Channel, it is extraordinarily expensive. The second thing we really dove into was doing archaeology at the site. People had believed that it was a sterile battleground, and I know Greg Dimick is here, and Greg, where are you? Greg is right over here. Greg chaired a committee, and through the first grant we got, Ann Hamilton, and I know Ann is here. Ann Hamilton ended up letting us see outside the perimeters of what is parkland if indeed there were artifacts. We ended up with eventually an American Battlefield Protection Program grant, which allowed us to find what is a surrender site. We took over 800 battle-related artifacts. So that is not a sterile battlefield. And it's something that we are learning about every day. But that is, I'll have to say, one of the things that we've really put our heart and soul into is also the San Jacinto Symposium. This is the 14th symposium that we have done, and we also do educational programs. But I did want to tell you a little bit about what we do. I hope you will enjoy the day, and we have some very special guests, and I want to introduce one right now. I've had the pleasure of working with Sylvia Garcia when she was the commissioner for Precinct 2. And Sylvia loves Texas history. She is someone who is also devoted to San Jacinto, and she has been at our symposia before, and I would love for her, if she has a moment, to say a few words to you. She is now a state senator.
Thank you, Jan, and if you'll just stay right here, because I'm going to present a proclamation further away. Oh, I thought I was doing pretty good, because I can hear myself, so I know y'all can hear me back there, but it's a pleasure for me to welcome you this morning to my district. It's really great for me this morning that I was just like 10 minutes away, and all I had to do is just sort of get up, throw on the jeans, and I'm here. But for me, it's just another one of those opportunities to really sink my teeth into more history. I think the more that we know about where we came from, the better we'll do in going into the future. So I'm here on behalf of the Senate to present a resolution which was passed by the Senate, and it reads in part, whereas the state of Texas is pleased to recognize the Battle of San Jacinto Symposium, which is taking place April 12, 2014, and whereas the San Jacinto Battleground Conservatory is sponsoring the Battle of San Jacinto Symposium as part of its mission to preserve, reclaim, and restore the San Jacinto battleground and build greater public awareness of the Battle of San Jacinto. And whereas the symposium will look at the Texas Revolution through the eyes of native-born Tejanos who fought for independence, 6 notable historians will share regional accounts of the Tejano revolutionary experience from the siege of Bejar and the Battle of San Jacinto. And the Texas Revolution was a remarkable milestone in our state's history, yet the story cannot truly be told without sharing the integral experiences of the many native soldiers who joined the fight for independence. Now therefore be it proclaimed that the Senate of the state of Texas hereby recognize the Battle of San Jacinto Symposium as a treasured event and commend all who work to preserve our state's rich and complex history, and be further resolved that a copy of this proclamation be prepared as an expression of our esteem from the Texas Senate, and it's signed by our Senate Secretary Patsy Spa. So congratulations, Jen, and everybody involved, and thank you, Ripley House, for hosting this great event right here in our neighborhood, and let's move on. Thank you. Thank you.
She is terrific, and her door is always open to her constituents and anyone interested in Texas history. This is a very personal symposium for me because I actually started school in Caracas, Venezuela, and I was telling Frank last night I never could understand the reason why my mother would not let me play with the maids' children. And my mother had never been out of Central Texas until she got on that plane going to Caracas. So this is something that has been a very emotional thing for me when I read about the old stories of the Tejanos and their struggles, and I realize that we are sometimes victims of prejudices that are passed down from generation to generation. So I'm hoping today we will be able to peel away some truth, like history. We will learn something from this, and the reason I'm stumbling is I want to thank publicly Felix Fraga for all of his help in putting this symposium together. And he just sat down, and he is accompanied by Robert Gallegos, who is new city councilman for the city of Houston. And I see Dr. Teorinas has just come in. Thank you for being here. So what a distinguished audience we have. Distinguished because you are here too, to learn like I am about our past. Now, having said this, we call this the Battle of San Jacinto Symposium. My colleague Jeff Dunn is an attorney in Dallas. He's an avocational historian. Everyone, from the Jim Crisp and the Frank de la Tejas of the world, defer to Jeff when it comes to the Battle of San Jacinto. So without any further ado, Jeff, would you tell us about that battle?
Thank you, Jan, and howdy and welcome to our 14th San Jacinto Symposium. We may even have a discussion today on how to pronounce the name of the battle. There seems to be a debate over that. When you talk about this battle and these events of 1835 and 1836, you have to initially think about the geography and the context of where Texas was during that time period. And as you see on this map, Texas was at that time in the far northern reaches of what was then Mexico, and right on the adjacent western border of the United States, right on the Gulf of Mexico. So it was in a very strategic location, and because of that, and because of the fertile soil, it was very attractive to many immigrants from the United States, and very coveted by the nation of Mexico. Now this map shows, it's a modern map of Texas, and it shows the location of where the battle was in East Harris County. And here are just a few basic facts about the battle. It was the final military encounter of the Texas Revolution in 1835-1836. Took place over a 2-day period, April 20th and 21st, near where Buffalo Bayou empties into the San Jacinto River in present East Day Harris County. On April 21st, the Texan Army under the command of General Sam Houston, numbering about 900 men, attacked and defeated an advanced division of the Mexican Army under the command of General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, numbering about 1,300 men. Is this noise, am I getting a little echo here? Okay. What made the battle significant, though, was not so much the defeat of Santa Anna's advanced division, but the fact that he was actually captured the next day. This was a particularly alarming event to the government of Mexico, since he was actually had the title of president, and was also a fairly spectacular result, as commented upon by many of the newspapers in the United States, that this ragtag army could somehow, after all these defeats at the Alamo and Goliad, somehow manage a victory like this and manage to capture the president of Mexico at the same time. Because of the consequences of the battle, it's widely regarded as the pivotal, decisive event of the Texas Revolution that secured independence, Texas independence from Mexico. And it was also a ticket to various political careers. All three presidents of the Republic of Texas, Sam Houston, Maribel Lamar, and Anson Jones, were veterans of the battle. And 15 Texas counties were named after veterans as well of the battle. One of the great events of the Texas Revolution, of course, is the siege and fall of the Alamo, which was in March of 1836, which occurred right about the time, just right after Texas was declared independence at Washington on the Brazos. This map illustrates the strategy that Santa Anna had in moving across Texas. He divided his army into 3 groups, Urea along the coast, a center route, which was commanded by Ramirez y Sesma and later Santa Anna himself, and then Gaona, who was supposed to go to Nacogdoches, but only made it to Bastrop and then back down to San Felipe. And meanwhile, the only obstacle in the way of the advancing Mexican army was the ragtag army of Sam Houston, which was put together at Gonzales, and you see that illustrated in the blue line. So Sam Houston was retreating eastward also, trying to advance farther away from Santa Anna's troops. Santa Anna finally enters Harris County, actually ahead of Houston's army on April 15th, aims for Harrisburg, which was stone's throw from where we are today, and that was where the Texan capital had fled from Washington on the Brazos. The Texan government managed to leave by boat and horse. You see the blue line. They managed to escape the oncoming Mexican army by going down to Galveston. Meanwhile, Santa Anna moves over to New Washington, which is today Morgan's Point. While Santa Anna is at Morgan's Point, Sam Houston's army enters Harris County from the northwest, arrives opposite Harrisburg, which incidentally had been burned by Santa Anna the previous day. From a captured courier, finds out that where Santa Anna is located, realizes that he has split himself off from the rest of his army, and learns that Santa Anna is going to cross the San Jacinto River near a place called Lynch's. So on April 19th, Houston crosses Buffalo Bayou, marches to Lynch's in an attempt to intercept Santa Anna's further advance, and he succeeds in doing so. He gets to the place where the battlefield is today. Santa Anna on April 20th burns New Washington and starts heading to the same place in an attempt to reach that crossing as well. This is a map from Yoakum's History of Texas, which was published in 1856. It is without question the best map we have of the battle and the battlefield. And it illustrates not only the movements of the armies, but also the topography of the area. You see a lot of marshland, trees, and open prairie. All of these features were very significant in determining how this battle unfolded. The Texan army actually reached Lynch's Ferry, you see that on the bottom part of that map, and then backtracked to the blue line that you see along Buffalo Bayou, protected by trees. And as Santa Anna approached from New Washington, you can see that the line of the Texan Army was blocking the route that Santa Anna would have to take to Lynch's Ferry. Santa Anna realizes this, deploys his men, and on the early part of April 20th, we see the first interaction between the two armies, just an artillery duel, not much of anything else. No one was hurt, although the Texan commander of the two cannon, the twin sisters, was wounded during that exchange. Santa Anna retreats, moves back beyond over a hill, so the armies are barely seeing each other. But later that evening, there was a cavalry skirmish. The skirmish was led on the Texan side by Sidney Sherman, and there's a lot of debate and controversy over why that occurred and the results of that. But the consequence was that neither side scored a significant victory, and they both went back to their respective camps. They spent the night about a mile from each other on what is now the San Jacinto battlefield. And the next day, the Texans lined up, and eventually, late in the afternoon, although there was a lot of discussion during the day about what they should do, they decided to attack the Mexican camp at 4 p.m. This was largely because they were expecting Santa Anna to attack their camp, but he didn't do so. Santa Anna was going to wait till the next day. So this map shows the clashes of the Army, and you often hear about the 18-minute battle. That's what occurred during this period of time. That was the amount of time that was lapsed between the initiation of the Texan attack and the breaking up of the Mexican lines. This is a remarkable map. It shows the armies in great detail, how they met each other. This is the famous painting by Henry McCardle that illustrates the battle. Of course, there was no internet back then, believe it or not, or TV or radio the only thing they had were newspapers. So a lot of these paintings came, of course, in many years later. The Mexican army scattered. The Texans continued to pursue for several hours. This was the period of time that's considered the greatest slaughter. There was a lot of pent-up anger and frustration among the Texans, and most of the Mexican dead occurred during this period, the latter couple of hours before sunset. Some of the activity actually continued with cavalry skirmishes and chases outside of the battlefield all the way up to Pasadena, and the star there on the left side of the screen is near Vince's Bayou, which is where Santa Anna was captured the next day. Two interesting, significant aspects of the battle. Sam Houston was wounded, his horse was killed. Of course, he recovered. Here he is wounded and meeting Santa Anna the next day. And this famous painting by Huddle illustrates it as well. Here's Santa Anna with Sam Houston on the ground. There were about 8 Texans killed. They were buried in a trench near the Texan camp. This monument on the right, the Brigham Monument, marks that site, which is the first monument built on the battlefield and placed there in 1882. And until the big monument was built, that was known as the San Jacinto Monument up until the 1930s. So when we think about this battle, it is a compelling story. And it is a story that has been told many times, and it's often told with a mixture of truth, error, and myth. But this is not really peculiar to the Texas Revolution or the Battle of San Jacinto. Winston Churchill once said, "History will be kind to me because I intend to write it." And that's essentially what the Texans did. They wrote it in the context of how they wanted to present this pivotal event in the history of the place that we today call Texas. So the challenge to historians is to try to get to the truth of the matter, knowing that the truth is really never really attainable. All you can really do is try to revisit the historical resources from time to time to locate new resources, to shed new light on the situation, as well as to interpret older resources and provide new insights on what these sources mean. Now, this year's theme is a topic that's often spoken about, but rarely examined on the level of detail that we are likely to get today. Of the ethnic groups living in Texas in 1835 and 1836, those Texans of Hispanic descent, today we refer to them as the Tejanos, were very few in number. Some estimates were about 1/10 of the total population of Texas at that time. But they were unique as a group because many of them, most of them, maybe all of them, were conflicted as to whether to support or oppose this concept of Texas independence from Mexico. It certainly had very significant consequences to them as well. So to help guide us today, I'm honored to introduce Dr. Jim Crisp, who will be our moderator. Dr. Crisp was born in Henrietta, Texas, and he graduated from Rice and received his PhD in history from Yale, and for many years has taught history at North Carolina State. He has won many awards in this field. He's been our moderator for 12 years, and he has done a fantastic job in helping us bring all our speakers together today. So without further ado, I'll welcome Dr. Crisp, and thank you very much for coming today. Move this out of your way.
Can you hear me okay? Yes. As Jeff suggested, this ain't my first rodeo. This is my 14th annual San Jacinto Symposium. I was privileged, along with Greg Dimick, to be a speaker in the very first one in 2001. I was a mere heckler in the audience in 2002, and in order to prevent me from ever doing that again, they made me moderator for life. In 1968, the spring of 1968, students of Hispanic descent from 3 high schools in San Antonio marched into their administrators' offices and said there's something wrong with the history we're being taught. And they were exactly right. None of the people from whom they had descended were in the books or in the classroom. And it's taken a long time to try to redress those grievances. I graduated, as Jeff said, from Rice in 1968, and I'd lived in Texas for 22 years and never heard of Juan Seguin. I didn't hear of Juan Seguin until I went to Connecticut. That ain't right. And much of what this panel has been doing over their scholarly careers, and much of what we're doing today is striving once more to redress the grievances, the genuine grievances, the honest and accurate grievances of those high school students from Bexar County those many years ago. I'm going to not take much more time, but to begin by introducing one at a time our speakers for this morning. The first of these is Raul Ramos, a native of San Antonio who went off to the Ivy League but came back to Texas. I can relate to that. Raul, the nicest thing I can say about Raul is, he just said, uh-oh, I don't think you heard that. No, one of the very nicest things I can say about Raul is that he is my editor. Raul co-edited with Monica Perales a really amazing little book published here in Houston by the Arte Publico Press, Recovering the Hispanic History of Texas. And if you haven't seen that book and haven't read the articles in that, you can buy it over at the University of Houston campus and perhaps from Texas bookstores around here, and it is really a revelation. And I know from personal experience how important having a good editor is. They make you look good, and Raul certainly, and Monica certainly did that in the case of the little essay that I did for that volume. Raul is Associate Professor of History at the University of Houston. And Raul, are you the director of the undergraduate program now too? I've heard that rumor.
Director of undergraduate studies.
director of undergraduate studies. That means he has to do a lot of the sort of scut work around the department, but it's an honor nevertheless, and they certainly are trusting him with their students. Raul has written a book that has won multiple prizes, including the T.R. Fehrenbach Award from the Texas Historical Commission, called Beyond the Alamo, the forging of a Mexican ethnicity and identity among those folks in San Antonio who found themselves with, they say 6 flags over Texas, they saw 5 of them, with one flag after another, and each time having to deal with new issues and new difficulties, and the story is an interesting one and an important one for Texas. Raul today is going to talk to us about the Tejanos of San Antonio and Bexar County, and there are few people better equipped to do that. So please welcome Dr. Raul Ramos.
Good morning. How's everyone doing today? First of all, I want to thank the San Jacinto Commission. Would especially like to thank Jim and Frank and Jan and David and everyone. I'd like to say one thing. First of all, this is not my first rodeo with this rodeo in particular either. Gosh, it's been almost 10 years ago. I pinch hit for someone. I don't know if you remember. The third symposium, that's right. First of all, I have to tell you guys that the program that Jim has put together every year, year after year, is impressive. If you've ever tried to put together a group of academics to speak on a subject, you'll know how difficult it is, and he's done a masterful job every time. But every once in a while, there's a hitch. In this case, they were bringing a historian from Mexico City, or from Mexico, and he had to cancel last minute. So they said, Raul, can you give us the Mexican side of the Texas Revolution? I said, okay. And actually, I'm going to speak a little bit about this question of sides to the revolution in a second. But what I did, in this case, it was kind of fortunate timing, because at that moment, the UN was voting on whether to was voting on the Iraq War. And Mexico happened to be on the Security Council that year. And Mexico voted against the United States in the Security Council. And there was a kind of shock that folks had said, how could Mexico do this? They're our neighbor. I thought we were on the same side here. And, but if you study history, study Mexican history, study American history, this should not come as any shock at all. Beginning with the fact that the United States invaded Mexico and continuing on to the present, questions of foreign intervention and American-Mexican relations have always been fraught and contentious and full of this history. So it's not an easy path. So in this case, it was an easy connection for me to make. We can make similar points about Russia and the Ukraine, for instance, and talk about Texas and Mexico and the United States in a similar context. But let me talk about San Antonio today. I'm gonna pretend I have a clicker here. Okay. What I want to begin by talking about, first of all, the memory of San Jacinto. And there's going to be a few more talks on historical memory in the afternoon, but I'm going to begin with historical memory because in many ways, that's our job, to talk about this memory, to talk about what we're doing. And you have to pardon me, I walk around, I like to walk around when I speak, and I feel like I'm about to jump out of my shoes here. I wanted to begin by comparing let me just tilt this up a little bit. By comparing San Antonio, comparing reactions to the actual San Jacinto, I didn't plug it into it's running through my computer, so thank you. And in particular, I wanted to compare reactions to the way the actual Battle of San Jacinto was memorialized in the two places. And in this case, in 1886, I saw an account in the Dallas Morning News about the celebration of the Battle of San Jacinto that was epic. There were thousands of people, there was a huge parade, there was a picnic, there were speeches and songs and poems, and they wheeled out veterans, and it was an amazing, amazing celebration. Meanwhile, I don't know if you can read it from where you're sitting, in the San Antonio, the same Dallas Morning News mentioned that in San Antonio, there was a quiet commemoration. Now, this could be for a variety of reasons. Maybe there was a bigger celebration around other things in San Antonio. Maybe Dallas wanted to put down San Antonio in their own newspaper. But if you click to the next slide, you'll see that the Dallas Morning News had many, many column inches devoted to this commemoration of the Battle of San Jacinto. And they published full speeches, and you could really get a sense for the attempt to make that battle, make that moment, the key moment in Texas history. But what I want to turn to then is, the Alamo itself. In some ways, in San Antonio, the Alamo has become a symbol, has become a way of decoding, deciphering the past. But in many ways, one of the challenges, I think, as a historian that I face much of the time is how the Alamo itself has been taken out of its context in multiple ways. And in some ways, there's been an attempt to universalize it. I have here what I call the postcard image of the Alamo, because it is a postcard. And it's kind of how you imagine the Alamo: sapphire blue skies, no people in front of it. I always ask people this question. I always feel compelled to ask it, so I'm going to ask it again. Think back to the first time you ever went to the Alamo. Can somebody raise your hand and tell me, what was your first thought, your first reaction when you saw it? Back there. How many of you had that same reaction? It was so small. Okay, the majority of you, right? Why? Why do we always think it's a lot smaller than we imagined? Can somebody?
Tourist asked me one day at the Alamo, where's the real Alamo?
Well, that's another question too, but you're right, yes.
I took a group of school kids there,
Right.
a teacher, and they all wanted to know where the basement was.
Well, right, because of Pee Wee Herman in that case. Right, that's right.
Where's the basement? That's all they wanted to find.
That's although this generation probably already forgot that movie. But I don't think it's a coincidence. One more comment, yes. Exactly, that's a big part of it. The legend of the Alamo, how legendary it is in our mind, in our history, in our memory, looms so large that's one way that we think, that's one way that it has become larger in our mind. But I would also suggest it has to do with the way it's been represented. What's missing in this photo? People are missing. You don't have a sense of scale. How big is it next to a person? What else is missing? The buildings around it. We don't see it in its proper context. We don't even see it in its real context. Can you click one more time? Here's another context we might see the Alamo in. We'll go ahead and click again. This is an 1856 watercolor of the ruins of the Alamo. And this might be one way you would have seen it in the early 19th century, in the late 19th century. When you see it this way, the Alamo doesn't seem quite as iconic, as majestic. It seems like ruins. It looks like Mayan ruins, if you will, with plants growing out of it, sort of what it was, a battleground. The trauma, the violence of the battle really comes through in this kind of image. What if this was the image that we remembered of the Alamo instead of that iconic postcard image? How would we think differently of that history? How might we be able to talk about other histories, Tejano history, for instance, if this was the way we remembered the Alamo, literally? A small footnote here, I had asked my publisher to make this the cover of my book. And he said, well, we got a problem here, Raul. I'm like, what's that? He said, your title of your book is Beyond the Alamo, and I said, yes. And then, but you really only devote out of 300 pages, about 2 pages to the actual Battle of the Alamo. So if you put an Alamo on the front and call it Beyond the Alamo, it's going to seem a little bit like false advertising or a bait and switch, if you will. So I let him go by and had another 19th century painting instead. Can you click one more time? Yes, question? Right.
So for a long time, history is about romanticizing the past, and now there's a lot more self-doubt that we need to write in the context of the wars that we've had since Vietnam.
Well, that's a good point. Every generation writes history in the context of what it's living now, and that's a large theme of what I'll be talking about. And that's exactly the place I'm going to end. How is this generation going to write that history? So again, when we start putting the Alamo in different contexts, here we have the Google map context. We see it when we start looking at it in different ways, picking it up and turning it visually, turning it historically, temporally, culturally, thinking about things. The question I always ask my students is, now really, who built the Alamo? I mean, who actually put brick on top of brick in the Alamo? It wasn't the priests, right? It was the indigenous people that were being brought into the mission, right? And what was it being built as? It was being built as a mission. So here you have the Alamo, this symbol of Texas history, of the Texas Revolution, as built by indigenous people, built by Indians, to become a Catholic mission, right? So you have that history is in there. It's not like we have to look anywhere else. It's right in front of our noses. The question is, how do we talk about that and what do we make of it next? Now, another way of doing this, turning around, recontextualizing, thinking about it in different ways, is by thinking about the names we give to these events and to these people. One of the issues that I don't even make it an issue. I just start talking about the war, the Texas Revolution, as the War of Texas Secession. Now, many people would think, and that was a conscious choice. If I use the word secession, anytime, especially if I'm talking to an American audience, and I use the word secession, certain things are going to click automatically, right? Number one, the Civil War, slavery, brother battling brother, right? Brother versus brother. And in the case of Mexico, this was a civil war. This was in the middle of a Mexican civil war. And sometimes we need to be reminded of that. And there's a way that using terms like Texas Revolution, because of the baggage that they carry, has become part of that universalized constant. And every once in a while, we need to break out of that customary way of thinking. Next. So one of the things this has done, and you'll excuse me, I'm going to read this real quick. The importance of this cannot be overestimated. We have Frank here, who has been hired with a group of historians to write the Texas standards for grade school history, and in particular, looking at the way school kids are being taught Texas history. And what we've seen year after year is that this is still an editing process. Here you have, if you go to the State Board of Education text standards, you'll see that the actual revisions of that history is written into the code itself. So you can see the original language, what was added by one group, what was taken out by another group, what was added by the next group, and you'll see that it's a constant iteration. In this case, this section that initially referred to the Battle of San Jacinto, but then was shifted to the Texas Revolution, emphasizes one particular point. And what I want you to focus in here is the word freedom. okay, that it brought civil, political, and religious freedom to Texas. Because that's the question. And again, here it's not put as a question. And that's what makes teaching Texas, that's, by the way, what makes teaching history in general interesting and useful and important, and a tool for thinking about the present and thinking about the future, is if we can raise it as a question rather than as a given, we feel more empowered in changing the future as well. Next. So when we think of whether the Texas Revolution brought civic, political, and religious freedom, and I'll put the question in mark in myself, did it bring this kind of freedom? Then there are certain places we need to look. Now, I'll just start right here by saying, if you were black in Texas, it most definitely did not bring freedom. It brought the opposite of freedom to you, period. It's not even a question in this case. You just need to look at the Constitution of the state of Texas to see that if you were black and you were not enslaved, you had to leave. Those were your only options, frankly speaking. And that was written into the Constitution. But let's continue. If you were Indian, if you were Mexican, what did this mean? And so to really understand the meaning of the Battle of San Jacinto, to really understand the meaning of the war in San Antonio, I think we need to look at it in this brighter context. I really want to, I'm going to go through my slides real quickly, and then I'll leave some time for question and answer if it's okay. Thank you. And as a historian, the way I teach my students to think about importance and significance is by situating it temporally. To understand an event, we need to know what happened before, what happened during, and what happened after to get an understanding of that context. When you go to the San Jacinto Monument, there, etched in stone, is a case made for why the battle is important. In this case, it's put in terms of American westward expansion on the monument itself. And I want to talk about other contexts. So if we're talking about the context of San Antonio in particular, in Texas more broadly, we need to understand this in terms of what was happening before, which is Texas was a frontier province of a newly formed nation, in this case Mexico, that was struggling with many of the growing pains of becoming a new nation, particularly around what kind of form of government they were going to have. In this case, Texas came out on the Federalist side of that argument. It was one that was attempting to establish peace and a kind of relations with various indigenous groups, some which had been there for millennia, and others who had just arrived, being pushed out of the American South, groups like the Cherokee, who were coming into Texas as a place of refuge, and in the context of slavery, the context by which American immigrants were brought into Texas, and slavery was not just allowed, but was seen as a necessary part of that, and where Tejanos were advocates for allowing slavery, particularly as a way of establishing the kind of economic safety net that was going to be necessary to keep Texas going. Now, again, during the war, we need to look at how people reacted during the war. What did people do? Now, one of the things we've been talking about that already came up was Tejanos being on the Texian side of the war, Tejanos being on the Mexican side of the war. But I have to be honest with you, the vast majority of Tejanos didn't pick up a weapon. They went and they left town. Think about where the Texas Revolution happened. It happened mostly in and around Mexicano homes, around their homes, around their ranches. So they left, they retreated. They wanted to protect their kids, they wanted to protect their family, and they really wanted to they didn't know how things were going to shake out. There was really, if there's one message you have for Tejanos, it's uncertainty and not knowing how things were going to turn out. And finally, the legacy and memory. If we are to gauge the impact of the war, we need to think of how Mexicanos, Tejanos endured after the war, what happened, and not only that, but how slavery boomed during that period immediately after the war. So these are the contexts that we'll look at the war next. As I mentioned before, Mexico in this case was in the midst of a civil war. I'll call it a civil war for for that context. And in this case, for many Tejanos, especially in San Antonio, the lens which they were looking at, what the events in Texas, was through this federalist lens. Now, this is not the first time Tejanos had been involved in a kind of larger national struggle. Some of the first battles of Mexican independence from Spain took place in 1811 and 1813 in San Antonio. In San Antonio, out on the frontier, you had Tejanos already eager to establish the Mexican nation. Perhaps the bloodiest battle in the history of Texas took place in the Battle of Medina in 1813. Think about it. There haven't been many battles in Texas to begin with, but many battles that produced this many deaths as the Battle of Medina between Tejanos and the Spanish crown and the Spanish soldiers. So we have here an important moment in Texas history that rarely gets put in context, but what I'm suggesting here is we need to look at Tejano reactions in that context as well. So what's going on in Texas is going on in other parts of the Mexican Republic. You have revolts against Santa Anna taking place in Yucatan, in Zacatecas, and other parts of Coahuila. I mean, this is they see themselves as part of a larger movement in some ways. And so this is, if we're going to connect what's going on with Tejanos, we need to connect it not only in terms of the American side, but in terms of the Mexican side as well. Next. The other context we need to look at this is in the indigenous context. As I mentioned before, Cherokees were coming in larger numbers, escaping essentially the difficult situation they were put in by American settlers in Georgia and Alabama and in upland areas. We also had a development of a very extensive trading and raiding frontier led by the Comanche that we're finding more and more about, where Comanche were ranging across those plains between New Mexico and Texas, and further north and further south, down as far as south as San Luis Potosí, where you had raiding parties going in and out, raiding in Mexico and then selling to the Americans on the other side. So you had this extensive network that we see as random violence, but one that is really part of a larger battle going on at that time. And finally, we see the work early work that missions undertook with other indigenous groups, both to attempt to secularize and assimilate those indigenous groups, sometimes successfully, sometimes unsuccessfully, but ones that created a different kind of relationship with Mexico and Mexican people. Next. Finally, we have to think about the options that Tejanos faced. As tensions rose between the Mexican government and Texas, Tejanos were being forced into a position where they had to choose sides, if you will. They were trying to negotiate what was going on in a shifting landscape. And this takes me back to, again, trying to understand where particularly Tejanos in San Antonio fit in the picture of American immigration into Texas. It was Tejanos who were essentially playing the middleman role for the empresario system. They were the ones, along with Austin, but they were the ones that were supporting various projects in Saltillo. They were the ones who were representing many of the empresarios in San Antonio and in Saltillo. They were the ones who were overseeing not only the system, but whenever there were problems, whenever there were tensions, attempting to smooth those over and attempting to keep the program going. So as Anglo-Texans began to demand statehood, can you go back just real quick? As Anglo-Texans were starting to demand statehood and wanting to take those demands to Mexico City, Tejanos were put in a bind. Did they side with Tejanos and demand statehood with them? Which brought a new problem, which, as was mentioned before, they didn't have the numbers in Texas at that point. So were Texas to become a state, they would immediately become the minority in that state. As long as they were part of Coahuila, they still had equality, if you will. So there was a variety of reasons why they weren't quick to jump on statehood. Not to mention that they also realized that would be seen, the process by which the Texians were pursuing for statehood would be seen as threatening to the Mexican nation as well. On the other hand, the Tejanos were part of these conflicts going on in Mexico. They were, again, taking this federalist side, so they were already in opposition to certain parts of the Mexican government. So when we start thinking about the question of allegiance, this idea of Texas side, what side are you on? Well, it's really complicated because there's multiple sides here. It's not just one, either or. There's a shifting landscape, a complicated landscape that really has to do with where people are in their lives and where they're coming from versus what somebody externally is imposing on them. Next. Finally, there's the context of American expansion. And in this case, we think of American westward expansion in broad terms, manifest destiny and so forth, but I really want to focus on one part of expansion here, which is what the role that Texas played, not just in expansion, but in the expansion of slavery westward. Texas was seen as the growth of, it was a growth area for the South, was a way of expanding cotton production, and slavery was a key. Many felt that slavery was the most important part for that expansion. So we have to put it in that context as well. Next slide. In some ways, the tensions came to a head and boiled over during the law of April 6, 1830, when, as a response to Mier y Terán's report to Mexico City, the colonization laws were modified in two ways. Two of those modifications had resulted in key responses by Anglo-Americans, or seen as threatening. The first was restrictions to slavery. And as soon as, and one of the things we have to always remember when we're thinking of the 19th century is any restriction to slavery was seen as the beginning of the end. Anytime something would come up, it was seen as, the way people talk about it in history, as the slippery slope, right? As soon as you had one restriction, it would mean the elimination of slavery altogether. And there was no middle ground. There was no, like, you could, shape it. It was either you allowed it totally or it was going to disappear. And that was the thinking at the time. So anytime you saw restrictions to slavery pop up, that was an immediate reaction. And secondly, there was a halt put to American immigration into Texas. And that was also seen as, how else could it be taken for Americans as a threat to not only the future of immigration into Texas, but as a kind of indictment of those who had come. What we do know historically is that Americans continued to come even after the law of April 6, 1830. But it also started raising the stakes, if you will. So this leads us to the Texas War. Was it a revolution or a war of secession? It depends on who you're talking about. People side by side can often fighting side by side can often have different motivations, often have different reasons for fighting. You could be fighting for your family. You could be fighting for the person next to you. You could be fighting for your caudillo. You could be fighting for your padrino. You could be fighting for a variety of reasons. And so until we're able to see that the war could mean different things, we won't be able to understand everyone's involvement in that war or those different meetings. So even if we look at Anglo participation, we see that the war itself changed over time, beginning initially involving Anglo-Texans who had been there for many years, for a decade, and Tejano Federalists, but one that, as the war continued, shifted into more American volunteers coming from the United States, from places like Tennessee, who had never lived in Texas, but were now claiming Texan belonging. Next. So as we think of the war in Texas, you've noticed I've been talking about how we talk about it, why, and how we refer to it, not necessarily in an attempt to try to become somehow historically accurate in the sense that that's the language that people used back then, because we know language changes, the meanings change, but one, in order to use language of today to help us unpack and untangle the past. So when we refer to Anglo-Texans, do we refer to them as colonists or do we refer to them as immigrants? They were immigrating from the United States to Mexico, after all, were they not? So to talk, and then to use the word immigrant in our contemporary context brings up a whole set of beliefs and assumptions. But what I want to suggest here is that we shouldn't be afraid of those. We tend to fear those, and maybe that's going to be my closing theme, like, don't be afraid of that. This is actually an opportunity, and I'll continue that in a second. The second is perhaps my initial reluctance to say, to understand the Tejano side. What we do know is that not only were there different perspectives and motivations among different people living in Texas, Tejanos had different positions as well. There were those Tejanos who had connections to Louisiana, who had business connections to Louisiana that had one set of interests. There were other Tejanos who had, say, connections to Monterrey or Saltillo. There were others who had lived there for generations and just wanted to be left alone. There were others who had alliances with Texians, business alliances, family alliances, intermarriages. And then there were others who saw Anglo-Texans as a threat, who saw them experienced mistreatment firsthand in places like across Texas. So you can't generalize about that there was one Tejano side, but even asking that question, I think, helps us understand that it's not just a Mexican side and an Anglo side, but really a much more complicated picture. Finally, it's this question of liberty and freedom. We talk about the Texas War as one about, as I mentioned in these Texas standards, as one of liberty and freedom, but we need to understand what liberty and freedom means to everybody. What does liberty and freedom mean to indigenous peoples? What does liberty and freedom mean to enslaved peoples? What does liberty and freedom mean to Tejanos on a ranch? What does liberty and freedom mean to indigenous people who used to live in a mission that had now been secularized, and the land that they were supposed to receive from that mission land starts getting sold away from underneath their feet and by other Tejanos? And so this is a much more complicated picture, one where it's not just an easy answer where there was a war and then everybody was better. This was a long, complicated process that had already been underway for decades before. Next. And as I wanted to emphasize, for Tejanos in particular, and if we were to try to understand their experience from the war, what I wanted to emphasize, I talked about before, during, and now after. The aftermath of the war for them was uncertainty. And I have to say, I don't think it's a coincidence. Let me put it a different way. That when we spent a lot of time in history class, when I was a kid at least, talking about the Texas Republic. And we might talk about the Texas Republic now as a viable nation, but certainly anybody living during that period didn't experience it that way. And so it should force us as historians to think about what was this Republic of Texas. And if you were living in San Antonio, the Republic of Texas, well, let me start. Dr. Valerio Jimenez is going to talk about the valley where the Republic of Texas was almost non-existent. If we go to San Antonio, it's existent but tenuous. We had two invasions that take place in 1842, right, by Vasquez first and then by General Adrian Wall in September of 1842, where the Mexican army marches into San Antonio and retakes San Antonio in 1842. And raises the Mexican flag once more, celebrates 16 de Septiembre once more as a Mexican town, and then promptly packs up and returns to Mexico, taking some families with them, and leaving, in a sense, a kind of message that two messages. One is that the message that they were directly giving, which is they required the San Antonio government to sign a letter saying they would protect the rights of Tejanos, of the Mexican population that stayed in San Antonio. So you already had a sense that there was a threat, that there were threats underlying. The feeling of threatening feeling that was underlying many Tejano people in San Antonio at that time. But for me as a historian, the message it sends is one of contingency, one of things are not as certain, things are not as absolute as they may seem, and that ground is not as stable. And so what does that mean for Mexican families living in San Antonio? It actually had a kind of negative impact. And that impact was one where, for many Tejano families, that Mexican invasion, in a sense, destabilized their claims to belonging. One where it was never quite certain whether Tejanos, when it would come down to it, would side with Mexico or would side with the United States. Certainly the War of 1846 between the United States and Mexico raised some of this question, although we should also ask that question for, say, Irish Texans living in Corpus and so forth. So this question of allegiance comes up again and again. Tejanos were forced to sign loyalty oaths, particularly if they wanted to access headright land grants and other value and other rewards of the war. Finally, if we're to measure the impact, not only the impact on San Antonio was the decline in population, Mexican population, but more importantly, the decline in political power and economic power in San Antonio, as over that period between the 1850s and 1880s, wealth and political power shifted from Tejano hands to Texian hands, to Anglo hands in San Antonio from that period on. Finally, one of the things about writing a book is, that was the way I was thinking about it 10 years ago. Now we look at it, and I'm constantly learning new perspectives. I'm constantly learning different ways of thinking about the war in Texas, the Texas War. Was it one of American redemption, as Brian DeLay talks about in his book, War of a Thousand Deserts? Was it a war that was driven by slavery, as Randolph Campbell has talked about, and as work by Torget is brought up more recently? Is this the place where the roots of Latino culture nationwide in the rest of the United States took place here in Texas, as Raul Coronado has recently suggested? There's still so much we need to know about Texas in this period. And finally, so I want to end then, last slide, with this question of the future. How do we talk about the Texas future? And one of the things that always amazes me is how this is an unsettled question. Not only are we talking about battles going on in Austin over the curriculum, not only but we're talking about that symbolism constantly. I saw Senator Garcia up here, and for me, my memory of Senator is involvement in the Houston 1836 soccer naming event that happened in 2006 here in Houston, where the soccer team, the Dynamo, the world champion Dynamo, were initially going to be called the Houston 1836, and that raised a citywide debate over what does that mean? What does it mean for a fan base that's going to be half Latino to be celebrating, to be cheering for a team named after the defeat of the Mexican army in 1836? And immediately said, well, you're Texan, you shouldn't care about the defeat of the Mexican army. And my point here is, and this is my takeaway point here, that for Tejanos today, how you talk about the Texas Revolution, how you talk about the Texas War has become a litmus test for whether you're American or you're not, or you're un-American. And I thought we'd gotten away from the Inquisition. I thought we had gotten away from the House Un-American Activities Committee. But my suggestion here is that it is a difficult terrain, and one that as a professional historian, I feel that it's important that we continue to walk through, that we continue to make mistakes if we do, but we need to make those mistakes because we need to keep trying to get not only a more accurate image, but one that is more expansive and helps us understand the reality of that period as well. I'll take a few questions. Oh no, there'll be time for questions. I know there was a couple questions as we're going along, but we're going to have another speaker, and then then both of us will come up and answer questions, and we'll before the next break. Is that correct? Okay. Thank you very much.
Our tradition is to have questions at the end of the afternoon. However, Dr. Ramos, who's in great demand, is going to have to leave before lunch today because he has to get to another conference, I think in in Atlanta. So if you want him to sign your copy of Beyond the Elements, or if you want to ask him a question, you need to nab him at the break that we will take. This is General Vasquez and General Wolf, and they've just invaded. I would also be remiss if I didn't recognize in greater extent than has been done before. Someone mentioned before that Dr. Tijerina is here. He is not our reserve medic in case someone has a heart attack. This Dr. Tijerina is, as they say, a real doctor, a professor of history. And I would, if you're not aware of his book, Tejanos and Texas Under the Mexican Flag, you really need to be. It's the Bible from which we all bring our perspectives, I think, and one that has really taught me a great deal. Andres, will you raise your hand just so people can see? So people can see how extraordinarily handsome you are. And one more thing, if you have a cell phone with you, either silence it or make it vibrate or turn it off entirely, because we don't need to have the cell phones ringing. Speaking of San Antonio, we have a native of San Antonio who's going to be coming up next. He's taught at 4 universities in San Antonio, currently Texas A&M in San Antonio. But Dr. Francis Galan is going to be talking to us today about probably the least known of all the Tejanos of the early 19th century, and those are the Tejanos of East Texas. I spent a week in Nacogdoches doing research several years ago and learned a great deal from not only the archives, which were revelatory. Much of what I had been told, I've given a talk before called Lies, Damn Lies in Texas History. And many of those lies apply to East Texas even more so than perhaps South Texas. But there is a secret history of Nacogdoches, and Dr. Galan is going to share that with us. Like all 3 speakers this morning, Craig Rell, who's coming next, Raul Ramos, Dr. Galan is a teacher as well as a scholar. And almost all of these scholars who are with us today have earned teaching awards as well as scholarly awards. And I, for one, am very anxious to hear what Dr. Francis Galan is going to teach us about East Texas Tejanos today. Francis.
Good morning, everybody. It is an extreme honor to be here, standing in front of everybody here, such an eclectic group of people. And I must say that I am indebted in terms of studying about Tejanos, and in particular East Texas, to Dr. Tijerina, who really provided a lot of inspiration for me at the very beginning when starting on this work in my dissertation at SMU under David Weber, and Dr. Frank de la Teja for serving on my committee and realizing, I better be careful. But when I was asked to talk about East Texas Tejanos and the Texas Revolution, my first thought was, honestly, estoy bien jodido. I'm really screwed. And I heard that from my dad growing up, because he was an immigrant from Cuba, and he would always, but he would always call me Pancho, and I never understand why he would call me Pancho if we would go to Miami to visit relatives, or go to Spain to visit my mom's relatives, and then once I started graduate school, he said that, well, his grandfather was actually Mexicano from Veracruz, Mexico, and at some point around the Mexican Revolution of 1910 had married a Cubana, a Cuban woman. And so I guess the Pancho is fitting, but my birth certificate actually indicates Francis. And my dad just couldn't say Francis. But in thinking about that and the parallels of revolution and realizing, like what I was saying about, are you either for us or against us? And in this case, it was Santa Ana. You realize, gosh, you don't know how this is going to turn out. So I realized, though, my dissertation work was on the community of Los Arayes, which people in Texas don't even know about. This fort was a Spanish fort established in 1721 and designated the capital of Spain in 1729. But the archaeological site is in northwestern Louisiana, and since it's not on this side of the border, we really don't talk about it. And in Louisiana, say in Lafayette, at a history conference there, not part of the lower Mississippi Valley, and so it's not really part of Louisiana. It's just kind of abandoned, if you will, orphaned in history. And so, in a sense, I began to conceptualize the region then as a border because of the fact that Spain had tried to prevent the French from establishing or capturing the silver trade of Mexico overland, because France had been denied free trade at the legal port of Veracruz. And so if you can't do it legally, why not go the back door? And that was to go from Louisiana through Texas into the northern Mexico. And so a lot of my research was based upon the 18th century. And so getting to the 19th century is a lot more tricky. But this is really just the beginning of what I want to share with you here. On Thursday, February the 11th, 1836, Colonel William Gray, a veteran of the War of 1812 and lawyer, related in his diary how he awoke early that day intending to have breakfast at the Sims house 16 miles away, but was delayed crossing the streams. Apparently, the Badias Creek in present Madison County along the old Madisonville-Badias Road. Upon arrival at 11 o'clock in the morning, Colonel Gray stated, quote, "We found the house to be kept by a Mexican named Antonio Rios, a native of Nacogdoches, who spoke the English language well and gave his name as Rivers. But his gypsy-like visage betrayed his origin. He is smart, obliging fellow, who has rented the place of Sims, a rude house of 2 rooms and an open passage, the common style. Gray and his horses were fed at the cost of 75 cents. But Gray added, quote, "Here we found a company of 11 men from Tennessee going to join the army," end quote. Decades later, in 1904, just 5 years before Colonel Gray's diary was first published, a 77-year-old Madison County resident named Gray Ariola gave an interview to the local paper claiming that among those who stopped and rested at Sims' place were Davy Crockett and James Bowie on their way to the Alamo. Regardless of the precise details, these stories not only capture the essence of Tejanos in East Texas, offering food and shelter to strangers, but also the complex web of commerce and kinship that transcended wars and revolutions. Sims, the name Colonel Gray mentioned first, refers to the family of Richard Sims, an Englishman who married Maria Concepcion Perez on September 22, 1789, at Natchitoches, Louisiana. 2 years later, Richard moved to Nacogdoches, became a farmer, and established a home, where Maria joined him by 1793, and together they had 5 children, 2 boys, José de Jesus and José Ignacio, and 3 daughters, Candelaria, Antonia, and Maria. Maria Perez Sims and her parents were Tejanos from San Antonio de Béjar. By 1809, according to the Spanish census for Nacogdoches that year, among the Sims neighbors were Edmund Norris, a farmer from Maryland who established his ranch Naconichi in 1804, where he and his wife, Sarah Sanders, also raised 5 children, 2 sons, Nathaniel and Samuel, and 3 daughters, Tomasa, Susana, and Jane. Another neighbor, Edmund Quirk, a farmer from Virginia, established his ranch Tiguitana at Nacogdoches in 1800, where his parents, Edmund and Anna Alsop Quirk, resided together with his daughter and an agregado, or that is somebody who is not blood but political in law, named William Sewell from Pennsylvania. Other immigrants to Nacogdoches, besides Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania, hailed from the United States, Canada, Europe, Cuba, Africa, Mexico, as well as the Apache. The majority of Nacogdoches residents, however, were Tejanos, more specifically, Adeseños, soldier settlers born at the Spanish fort of Los Adayes in northwestern Louisiana that had been abandoned in 1773, as well as the Bejareños from San Antonio. And so there is then at Los Adayes this marker that indicates this was the site for this old Spanish fort. And it's located only about 15 miles west of Natchitoches, and it's along State Highway 6, which if you cross from the Texas side along State Highway 21, you end up coming along, and it's the old Camino Real. And it is there then that the Spanish had tried to check French westward expansion. And the old stone fort, in the image on the left-hand side there, established after Nacogdoches had been founded in 1779 by Antonio Guilibarbo, who was a native from Los Adayes. From Los Adayes, born there in 1729, where his father, Mateo, was already a soldier. And interestingly enough, before Mateo had gone out to Los Adayes, he had a daughter baptized in the Mission San Antonio de Valero, which later became famous as the Alamo. So he had that tie to San Antonio as well. And but then many of the settlers who were at Los Adayes, they were ordered by the king to abandon their post. And in 1773, you had a kind of internal Trail of Tears in which these settlers are forced to come to San Antonio. Some of them stay there, others return, and they're temporarily on the lower Trinity River at Bucareli. Disease, Comanche raids forced them to Nacogdoches, and they established the post there in 1779, which is the site of a former Spanish mission, and it also has this connection with the Nacogdoches, the Caddo Indians as well. So perhaps their claim to being the oldest town in Texas, does have some kind of ring of truth to it, if you include the Native American. Among those residents at Nacogdoches was a Bejareño named Juan Seguin, age 47, farmer, who migrated to Nacogdoches in 1799 with his wife Josefa Gomez, where they had a daughter named Manuela Seguin, and an Antonio Ariola, age 48, farmer from San Antonio de Bejar, who had helped Antonio Guilibarbo establish Nacogdoches in 1779, where Ariola and his wife, Ana Jacoba X, a Tejano native from Los Adayes, settled and had a son named Eduardo. Meanwhile, the Antonio Rios mentioned in Colonel Gray's diary may in fact be the one listed on the 1809 Nacogdoches census as José Antonio del Rio, age not shown, son of Manuel del Rio, age 22, farmer from Nacogdoches, and Elena Padilla, age 18, also from Nacogdoches, and siblings Jose Viviano and Joaquina, ages not given. It's quite likely the case that Antonio Rio's parents were originally from Los Adayes, especially since my own list of those Tejanos originally from Los Adayes includes an Antonio del Rio, who appears in a 1782 census of San Antonio de Bejar, despite having signed a petition with Guilibarbo in 1773 to return to East Texas. Antonio del Rio evidently stayed behind, since his name appears on another petition in 1778 for better lands to settle in San Antonio. And so these are some of the more frequent names that appeared for Los Adayes, but these come from census records, Spanish census records that I pulled from the 1780s and 90s from San Antonio, for Nacogdoches in the 1790s, and even La Bahia, which became Goliad in 1829 for the census, their census of 1809. And so a lot of the names that appear on here are names that end up being involved in one way or another with the Texas Revolution. It's just that in terms of East Texas Tejanos, this really not part of this discussion. And yet, there's such deep ties between San Antonio and East Texas, it's not even funny. Raul mentioned the Battle of Medina when the Spanish military under Arredondo, basically they killed about 1,000 of the rebels, and many of the Tejanos, many of them had fled, become refugees. They fled to Louisiana. They went to Natchitoches, and so you can see the names of Bejareños there buried at Natchitoches, at least according to the St. Francis Catholic Church records there. And so then it's like you just have like this repetition in terms of these relations of Tejanos and Natchitoches, Louisiana. And it's in that context then that, you have Stephen F. Austin arriving to Texas from Natchitoches and is being escorted by a group of Tejanos. And so there are these tremendous ties then and movement, because soldiers from that fort in Los Adayas were stationed elsewhere in Texas. So then, getting back to this, we must keep in mind that the dropping of prefixes and use of middle names in Spanish are not uncommon, especially on the frontier, not to mention, and I'll show you later on another slide, anglicized versions of these Hispanic names. For example, Del Rio, that becomes Rivers, and there's many other names as well. And so we're related in ways that we don't even realize. Regardless, the point here is that the children of Tejanos in East Texas, including Anglos, such as Nathaniel Norris and another named John Durst, together with Adeseños and Bejareños, fought and died in the Battle of Nacogdoches against the Mexican government many years later in 1832, after having survived the violence and chaos of independence from Spain and the Fredonian Rebellion. And so in the Battle of Nacogdoches, August 2nd of 1832, the ayuntamiento, that is the local government at Nacogdoches, refused to give up their arms. Sounds like a very Texan thing, to refuse to give up your arms. Come and take it. As ordered by Colonel José de las Piedras, commander of the Mexican 12th Permanent Battalion at Nacogdoches, tensions were high due to the controversial immigration law of 1830 that Mexico passed prohibiting further immigration from the United States into Texas, as well as the confrontation over taxes and commerce at Anahuac. Many Texans initially supported General Santa Anna when he opposed the Centralists in Mexico City and favored states' rights under the Federalist banner in Constitution of 1824. And that's one of the things that's rather interesting, is that there is a conversion that takes place among Santa Anna himself, because you got to keep in mind that he had become the hero of Mexico most recently in 1829 when he helped lead the resistance to the invasion of Spain, trying to take Mexico back as a colony. And Santa Anna had handed over the presidency, and he retired. He went back to his estate, and of all places, Veracruz, and he could have lived out his retirement. Much like, I dare say, Hernán Cortés could have just stayed in Cuba, and he didn't have to go to Mexico. But Santa Anna would end up changing his political position. And so then, the Nacogdoches local government had formed a national militia in response to the threat Colonel Piedras posed. After he refused to rescind his order and declare for Santa Anna, Piedras positioned his men at the old stone fort, a local church, and in his headquarters, which became known as the Red House. After initial withdrawal following a Mexican cavalry charge, the Texans fought back, house to house, captured the stone fort, Sims Tavern, Thorne's Store, and Robert's Store, forcing the Mexicans back into their main fortification and ultimately driven away from the Red House, where Colonel Piedras and his troops evacuated and headed to San Antonio. And so there's a marker in Nacogdoches to this battle of Nacogdoches, 1832. And we'll come back to the names here in a little bit, but it's quite interesting. The next day, some 16 Texans, including James Bowie, gave chase and skirmished with Mexican troops at Buckshot Crossing on the Angelina River. Colonel Piedras hid in the home of John Durst, near present Douglas, where his men turned against him. Captain Francisco Medina took command from Piedras and surrendered Piedras and his men, who were then escorted back to Nacogdoches. Asa Edwards, a member of the National Militia and a name associated with that Fredonia rebellion that Stephen F. Austin had opposed in 1826, 1827, transferred Colonel Piedras to San Felipe and handed it over to Stephen F. Austin. Colonel Piedras was paroled and headed to Mexico, while Bowie marched Piedras' remaining soldiers to San Antonio, where they were discharged. In the aftermath of the battle, Colonel Piedras had lost 47 men who were killed and around 40 wounded, while 3 Texans were killed and 4 wounded. And just down the list, on the left-hand side there, among Texans killed in this battle was a Tejano named Don Francisco Encarnacion Chirino, alcalde or city councilman from Nacogdoches and a descendant of the Chirino boys from Los Adayas. The first one was a Lázaro Chirinos, who was a servant in the Ramon expedition of 1716 when Spain was trying to take back East Texas for the second time. And then his sons become soldiers at Los Adayas in 1735. There's like 6 of them, and some of them end up at the San Antonio garrison and others at the Los Adayas. And so then you have the town of Chirino, Texas, although pronounced locally as Chirina. And I went in thinking, Chirino. It's like Chirina, Texas. Located midway between Nacogdoches and San Agustin off State Highway 21 along the Old Camino Real, was named for this brave Tejano. And so when you drive in through there and you go into these little towns in the back country, it's like you can't help but just ask questions like, who are these people? Because you see Mora and Chirino and Ibarbo, and it's like, well, I knew people like that growing up in San Antonio. They were my friends. But you didn't really make that connection until much later. Among the leaders of the National Militia and veterans of the battle were Vicente Cordova, who served as one of the captains, as did Bailey Anderson Sr., Isaac Burton, Wyatt Hanks, and Frederick Mose, followed by Lieutenant Nathaniel Norris and the ensigns Antonio Menchaca, not Frank de la Tejas Menchaca, Juan Mora, and Adolphus Stern. And so you had in this battle these individuals then who knew each other. They had many years of living on the Texas frontier. As a late historian, Archie MacDonald stated, the Battle of Nacogdoches is an important, lesser-known conflict that cleared East Texas of military rule and allowed the citizens to meet in convention without military intervention from Mexico City. For the East Texas Tejanos at Nacogdoches, having lived and worked intimately with Anglos over the years on the frontier as farmers, cowboys, or soldiers, the arrival of many new immigrants in the 1820s and 1830s from the United States tested their loyalties beyond the Mexican nation to the region and to each other. On the eve of the Texas Revolution, before the first shots fired at Gonzales in October 1835, Anglo-Americans surrounded Tejanos in the newly created municipalities of San Agustin, Sabine, Tejana, Jasper, and Red River, all carved out of the vast Nacogdoches District. And so the more northern ones don't show up on this map, but you can see a few of them. You can see Nacogdoches, you can see San Agustin, and you can see let's see, over there to the east. And Liberty is further down to the south, and so then you have all these districts. Liberty being created in 1731, and Nacogdoches municipality being created in 1831, and then the others, San Agustin, 1834, and the rest in 1835. Historian Paul Lack argues that a nervous neutrality descended upon these Texas Tejanos because committees of violence and safety, which had formed in response to the rise of power of Santa Anna and had switched to the centralist cause, threatened confiscation of property belonging to anyone who refused to cooperate with measures of the committee, like statements that urged a political break with Mexico. According to Lack, Captain Vicente Cordova of the local militia at Nacogdoches made rhetorical appeals to God, the law, tradition, tranquility, and preservation of property that reflected mainstream conservative ideals. Rather than an open political commitment one way or another, Captain Cordova agreed not to resist the Texas Revolution, whose leaders did not insist that Tejanos fight in the war against other Mexicans. Cordova's militia, in effect, became a permanent home guard. However, by November 1835, Cordova ordered his company to dissolve after the siege of Béjar had begun, and rebel Texan forces, joined by Tejanos and a few Mexican Federalists, fought General Cossa's Mexican troops in Santa Ana, in San Antonio, and the Alamo. Apparently, Cordova had grown doubtful of the objective of the Texas Revolution. By early 1836, Nacogdoches became more divided than ever over the decision of Texas leaders to move towards independence altogether and abandon Mexican federalism. East Texas Tejanos were openly against the independence in March, which made them suspect among the Anglo majority. There were rumors since December of the previous year that Tejanos and Nacogdoches had planned a revolt with Santa Anna and the Cherokees, which stoked greater alarm when Mexican centralist troops advanced eastward in April. Meanwhile, the uneasy peace at Nacogdoches was nearly destroyed after April 9th when the local alcalde, David Hoffman, notified residents of the requirement by the Texas Convention of the previous month for military conscription, and that East Texas Tejanos in particular should be organized into a separate unit. Those Tejanos who did not line up to serve were to move to Louisiana, something that they had been familiar with, or west of the Brazos. Tejanos did form a company, but so did around 250 Anglo-American volunteers who set about to disarm Tejanos. By April 14th, Cordova made it clear that any confiscated weapons had to be returned as evidence of faith. Otherwise, he declared, quote, "If the Mexicans are thus to be treated and suspected, I beg it may be remembered that they have it in their power if they are so disposed to do much mischief," end quote. The local Texas military commander, Arian, accepted Cordova's terms, and his militia were allowed to protect Nacogdoches. By April 17th, just 4 days before the Battle of San Jacinto, Commander Arian wrote General Sam Houston that the Tejano militia at Nacogdoches was ready to defend the country against the Indians who are pillaging, but will not fight their countrymen in the present instance. In other words, that they were of use to the Anglo-Texans by mentioning the fact that you also have Indians out there as well, not just Cherokees, but as one of the census shows, there are also about 200 Choctaw, and there are about another 100 or so band of Caddo. Not to mention out on the plains, the Comanches. As Lack notes, while the East Texas Tejanos did not rise in armed rebellion against the Texas cause in 1836, they refused to support war against the centralist government in Mexico City and Santa Ana. That said, however, I would argue that East Texas Tejanos also carried themselves as their ancestors had done long before, having learned from Caddo neighbors to play off both sides. East Texas Tejanos were skillful at frontier trade amongst any racial or ethnic groups and intermarried whenever such opportunities to expand commerce or ranching presented, all the while maintaining peaceful relations despite the world closing in upon them. In other words, as historian Raul Ramos argues for Tejanos of San Antonio de Bejar, the East Texas Tejanos had always been trying to find the balance on a frontier far from Mexico City and so close to Louisiana. And like any good Tejano on the Texas frontier, likely to disobey distant government officials whose views did not reflect the reality of their lives at home and the desire for free trade, God, land, and liberty, whether that government be Spanish, Mexican, or American, Texan or American. Whether Davy Crockett or Jim Bowie actually stopped at Sim's home, as recounted by Gray Ariola, only reinforces the notion that volunteers from the United States did stop to rest, eat, and drink in East Texas on their way to San Antonio and interacted with Tejanos from Nacogdoches. But more than that, East Texas Tejanos hedged their bets on the Texas Revolution in case the new generation of Anglo-American immigrants turned against them, regardless of whether or not they helped to defeat Santa Ana. Future research on Anglos and their children listed in the Nacogdoches census of 1809, who knew the East Texas Tejanos best and became comrades in arms at the Battle of Nacogdoches in 1832, as well as their business dealings, may reveal the possibility that at least some East Texas Anglos also hedged their bets. Certainly, the Anglos listed in the 1835 census records for the newly created municipalities of East Texas also deserve closer scrutiny, just like the family backgrounds of Tejanos who were truly Texan to the core. And so then, the slides that I have that follow, I just started going through the census records that I've had with me in my possession for probably 10 or 12 years, and I said, someday I want to get to 1830s, get out of the 18th century. But what's amazing is how, when you look at these lists, the first 6 census records, you end up, that's my timer, you end up noticing that there are various different census records, and you have, in this first one, the census for Nacogdoches. This is where the Tejanos were. The Nacogdoches, you see 668 total residents. Majority of the families are Hispanic. 37 servants, and among those servants, there were 4 that had Hispanic surnames. But you have the Juan Moras, Antonio Menchaca, Jose Ángel Chirino, even Miguel de los Santos Coy, which is connected to Trinidad and his brother Antonio de los Santos Coy from San Antonio. But you also have Anglos that are settled there, right there in Nacogdoches among them, and including Henry Rueg, who actually is an immigrant from Switzerland, and Adolphus Stern, who was a merchant from Germany, and apparently whose father was Jew and his mother was Lutheran, and Allen and his brothers from New York, or Roberts from Virginia, or Rusk from South Carolina. And so they were among these Tejanos in Nacogdoches. And you end up seeing as well another census that has maybe a few names that overlap with the previous slide I showed you, but the majority also Hispanic. And so you see Jose de los Santos Coy, Sepúlveda. That wasn't originally part of Los Adayes, but basically what happened was that in the aftermath of the Louisiana Purchase of 1803, you have Spain having tried to establish defensive settlements. And so some of the, and especially on the Trinity River. And so some of these names that appear as Tejanos later, they came out of these generation of the Spanish troops that were established around the time of the Louisiana Purchase. And Manuel Chirino, Teresa Mora. But you also have, interestingly enough, Ariola, Carmona, Cordova, Gonzalez, Rodriguez, and an Anglo sample as well. And again, seeing these names there, even of Vicente Micheli, who is a merchant from Italy, who ended up becoming a land speculator and acquiring ranches beginning in the 1790s, had requested permission to establish a cotton gin in San Antonio in 1804. So you're beginning to see immigrants who are settling in and amongst the Tejanos in Nacogdoches. And then, when I was looking for the name of Vicente Cordova, I guess it would only be natural that he would be east of town to Atoyac, but why he's the only one listed on this particular census, I don't know. But nonetheless, and his occupation is not listed as well. But we continue then, and I'm just kind of go through this to kind of speed up the process. We have southwest of Nacogdoches. We have then northwest of Nacogdoches. And then we have the Berry settlement, which is also reported along with Nacogdoches. And we keep going, and you see then from west to Angelina, except now you're talking about mostly Anglo families and a higher number of African Americans who are listed as negro in the Spanish census records and translated as black. And you do have some Tejanos who are present there as well. And you'll notice the names of Durst at the bottom. And so we keep going then. It's like there's the Williams settlement near Nacogdoches, which is all Anglo except for one Tejano and a mixed couple of Anglo and Hispanic. And so then we get to then San Agustin. And San Agustin, established as a municipality in 1834, you see no Tejanos who are settled there. But what's interesting here is that the category for religion is listed, unlike it was for Nacogdoches. And although overwhelmingly listed as Catholic, they are more nominally Catholic because, and in this particular instance, it just says one Protestant and one Universalist. But as we see through the next census and why it's separated again, although, and there's not much overlap, is you end up having Baptists and Methodists who are also listed as well. And so then perhaps then you're talking about Anglos who are nominally Catholic, but in actuality they're Methodists and Baptists. And in the case of the Spanish Empire and the New World, it wasn't uncommon that, say, if you were Pueblo Indian, if you were Spanish 6 days of the, 1 day of the week on Sunday, the rest of the week you were Pueblo. Or if you were Jew and you were expelled, the result of the Inquisition, you were a converso, and you ended up becoming Sephardic, and we don't even really know that story or discuss that story. But the fact of the matter is that this issue then of religion is interesting because it's not so much just from this American perspective, but from the Mexican perspective. The Holy Office of the Inquisition wasn't finally dissolved until 1820. And so then, with the rise of this liberalism, of this federalism versus centralism, and the rise of liberalism and liberals versus conservative, not only in Mexico, but across Latin America, you have the beginnings of this advance of another frontier contending the Catholic Church that was concerned in the 1830s within this context of the Civil War in Mexico of losing their fueros, their special privileges that the military also had. And this was a constant struggle for Mexico, as a matter of fact, against the church until 1929, when they finally called a truce. And so there's another element in here that is quite fascinating. But for the most part then, you have other municipalities being established, and that's it. Okay. And I couldn't stop going through the census records. And so, thank you very much.
I thought of 4 or 5 things I wanted to say about East Texas while Francis was speaking, but I'll defer. Just before we take our break now, let me please urge you to be back before 11:15 because we're going to begin right on time. But first, I want to give Professor Angelina Caballo about 2 minutes to explain the questionnaire that you received from her and her colleagues today. And then we'll take our break and be back promptly before 11:15.
Good morning, everyone. Ooh, that's loud.
Further away, back.
Further away, okay. Good morning. Right now I'm
It helps if you don't touch it.
with a private effort right now in Austin, Texas. We're trying to get a statue made in honor of Lorenzo de Zavala. And the questionnaire in front of you is the half a page. It should be yellow in color. We are trying to get feedback if, first, Lorenzo de Zavala is a good choice, and second, if we could get a second possible statue, who do you think would be the best person to represent founding father of the Texas Republic? And when you have filled out your forms, please leave them at the table in the front. So far, good news, we're only needing feedback from our area here in this part of the state, Brownsville, and El Paso. Otherwise, we've had feedback from everyone. So far, it's been very positive, and many historical associations have been on board, and hopefully we'll be doing well. Word on the Capitol is, the good news is, if we're not able to get it directly in the building, then we can get it in the library with Lorenzo de Zavala's name. But like I said, we just need to have feedback and support. As long as we have enough people who are interested in this, then we can make this happen. So please do give your response. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Lorenzo de Zavala is, of course, the name on the State Archives of Texas. Also, Lorenzo de Zavala Jr. was a prominent citizen of Houston in the early years of the Texas Republic. And you saw him, although you might not have recognized him, in that picture of the surrender of Santa Ana at San Jacinto. He was one of the translators. This has been wonderful so far. Thank you for your patience and attention. Take a break, and we'll start promptly at 11:15.